Mayuresh Joshi, morning. Is there a case for a re-rating for the entire PSB sector because of this recapitalization, and are you already reworking your price targets on most of these?
Morning, Aisha. So yes, I think as Sandeep was mentioning, I think the restructuring of these recap bonds is going to be extremely critical. But yes, I think a general sentimental push through for PSU Banks is very much on the cards. With this moves, it does boost their capital adequacy needs, the balance sheet funds that they so desperately needed for expansion. A lot of legacy issues might still continue on their balance sheets and that might plague them for the next 2 to 3 quarters. So as the cleanup process gets completed by the end of this year and as part of that confusion, as the finance minister was mentioning yesterday, comes through this year and the next year, I think the next 2-3 years are looking very, very interesting for the PSU space. Under-owned, I think valuations extremely cheap. But yes, I think this move extremely positive for these banks. As Sandeep was mentioning as well, I think a lot of these banks are trading much below their book value. So I think marginally, I think diluted, but over a longer period of time, I think it's going to be earnings accretive as more and more lending start taking place. So I think State Bank is something that I've always liked. But yes, I think the larger banks, something like Bank of Baroda, Punjab National Bank, I think these are very, very interesting plays now in the market. Again, as I said, I think 2 to 3 quarters, I think the cleanup might continue, but over the next 2 to 3 years, I think the larger PSU space looks interesting, but I think generally the rally should continue. There is one more flip side to the whole thing. I think NBFCs, which were enjoying a lot of financial funding, specifically at the expense of PSU banks, with lending coming through, with a lot of capital infusion coming through, I think they've also got the lending prowess at their hands. So I think a lot of NBFCs where valuations were on the higher side might just feel the heat if PSU banks start ramping up their credit lending process, specifically to retail stroke MSME.
Okay, Mayuresh, talking about some of these sectors, cement, and the earnings are clearly reflecting the growth recovery there. We've seen that with ACC, Ultratech, and now Ambuja as well has turned out to be a beat. Further scope for an up move in the names, in the stocks?
Remain positive, Aish, and going by numbers and expectations of demand recovery expected to come through for the sector as a whole because of the push through both in terms of housing by the government and infrastructure that the government is embarking upon in a big way, whether that be Bharatmala or irrigation projects. I think that's going to give a huge impetus to the sector as a whole. Secondly, I think the kind of utilization levels that these companies were at around 72 odd percent, you're probably going to see increase in utilization levels, which will definitely give an uptick in terms of the leverage onto their balance sheets. Thirdly, again, with lesser demand or capacities getting added and demand probably expected to remain extremely strong, that factor will also aid in price realization growth for these companies, offsetting the kind of input cost inflation, specifically from petcoke and freight costs that we had witnessed. So yes, I think as a sector remain extremely positive and optimistic. Our picks probably from the mid-cap space still remain Ramco Cements, where our belief is that the kind of cash flows that they generate can be used to increase their grinding capacity, and that probably will abet them in terms of an EBITDA per ton parameter over the next few years. And JK Cement, I think, along with the grey volumes, which will show very reasonable amount of growth, the white cement realizations should also abet them in their overall earnings trajectory. So I think these two names from the mid-cap universe is something that I continue to prefer. Large caps, I think Ultratech was my favorite pick. It continues to remain so. But yes, I think Ambuja ACC numbers have been very, very impressive. So yes, as a space, extremely positive over the next 2 years.
Now, Mayuresh, would you recommend to your clients to buy PSU banks after this double-digit record move?
So I think, Tanveer, as I said in the morning again, one really needs to look at this perspective over the next 2 to 3 years. As Nikunj was rightfully mentioning, I think a lot of these small and mid-cap PSU banks desperately needed capital. So it was not that they were sitting on tons of cash. They already had balance sheet issues in terms of asset quality. They were grappling with high provisioning, high credit costs. So I think the balance sheet infusion or the capital infusion was much needed for all these banks. Secondly, in terms of the credit growth scenario itself, I think for the industry as a whole, you're probably looking at 6.5% for the year gone by. And it's not that with the recapitalization infusion that comes in, you're probably going to have credit growth rebound in a jiffy. So it's going to take time. Third, again, as I mentioned, clearly I think the legacy issues on their balance sheet will very well continue over the next 2 to 3 quarters. So how these recapitalization bonds are structured, and as the Exchequer was mentioning, partially it will come to in this financial year, partially in the next. So I think it's a long drawn out process in terms of the infusion actually coming onto their balance sheet, they recalibrating their balance sheets, and then probably looking at sectors and particular stocks that can really do well once this lending process kick-starts. So yes, I think State Bank is something
Mayuresh,
that...
Mayuresh, appreciate your time. Gautam.